The D-Day Normandy landings marked a pivotal turning point in modern history, forever altering the course of human conflict. This fateful event, which unfolded on the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, would ultimately seal the fate of Nazi Germany. In the early months of 1944, as winter's chill began to recede from the European landscape, the Allies were busy weaving a complex tapestry of deception and strategy. Designed to mislead the German High Command about their intentions for the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied France, the seeds of this grand deception, code-named Operation Fortitude, had been sown months earlier with the creation of fictional military units, phantom radio transmissions, and carefully crafted leaks of false information. This intricate web of deceit was intended to convince the Germans that the main Allied invasion would occur at the Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy, thereby drawing German defenses away from the actual landing sites. As the Allies worked to strengthen their deception, they were also engaged in a frenzy of logistical activity, assembling the vast armada of ships, troops, and equipment necessary for the invasion. In the ports and harbors of southern England, a forest of masts and antennae rose above the crowded docks as thousands of vessels, from tiny landing craft to massive troop ships, were readied for the journey across the Channel. The air was thick with the smells of coal smoke, diesel fuel, and freshly cut timber, as the sound of hammering, welding, and shouted orders filled the air. In the midst of this chaos, a small group of senior officers, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, pored over maps and intelligence reports, refining their plans for the invasion. Eisenhower, a man of unyielding determination and strategic genius, had spent years preparing for this moment, studying the lessons of history and learning from the mistakes of others. He knew that the success of the invasion would depend on a delicate balance of factors, including the weather, the tides, and the deployment of German forces. As the Allies made their final preparations, the Germans were also busy strengthening their defenses along the Normandy coast. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had been tasked with fortifying the Atlantic Wall, a series of coastal strongpoints and fortified bunkers designed to repel any Allied invasion. Rommel, a master of defensive warfare, had spent months inspecting the beaches, studying the tidal patterns, and positioning his troops to maximum effect. He knew that the key to defeating the Allies lay in stopping them at the water's edge, before they could establish a solid foothold on French soil. The town's narrow streets were lined with ancient stone buildings, their roofs a patchwork of slate and tile, while the surrounding countryside was a tapestry of green fields, wooded hedgerows, and sparkling streams. It was a peaceful, idyllic scene, one that would soon be shattered by the sound of gunfire, explosions, and the cries of the wounded. The air was heavy with anticipation, though not in the town itself, but among the Allied forces gathered in southern England, where the largest amphibious invasion in history was poised to unleash its fury upon the Normandy coast. In the hours leading up to D-Day, a sense of tense expectation gripped the Allied troops, who were busy making final preparations for the journey across the Channel. On board the USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the horizon as he contemplated the enormity of the task ahead. The ship was part of a vast armada of over 5,000 vessels, including landing craft, troop ships, and warships, which were to convey more than 130,000 troops to the Normandy beaches. Meanwhile, in the skies above England, thousands of aircraft were being readied for the largest airborne operation in history. At RAF Pottery in Devon, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were busy checking their equipment and attending to last-minute briefings. These brave men, led by General Maxwell Taylor, were tasked with securing key objectives behind enemy lines, including bridges, road junctions, and strategic strongpoints, which would facilitate the advance of the seaborne troops. As the clock struck midnight on June 5th, a fleet of over 1,000 bombers, comprising B-17, Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and Lancaster aircraft, took to the skies, bound for their targets in Normandy. The air was filled with the thunderous roar of engines as the bombers formed up into tight formations, their navigation lights twinkling like stars in the darkness. Their mission was to soften up the German defenses, blasting a path through which the invading troops could pour onto the beaches. In the German High Command, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, still unaware of the impending invasion, had retired to his quarters, exhausted from a long day of inspections and briefings. His superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was similarly oblivious to the danger lurking across the Channel, despite intelligence reports suggesting that an Allied invasion was imminent. The Germans were caught in a state of heightened alert, yet uncertain as to where and when the blow would fall. As the night wore on, the German High Command remained in a state of uncertainty, despite the ominous signs of an impending invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, still unaware of the Allied armada gathering across the Channel, had retired to his quarters at La Roche-Guillaume, his headquarters located about 50 miles northwest of Paris. His staff, however, continued to monitor the situation, poring over intelligence reports and monitoring radio traffic, searching for any indication of where and when the Allies might strike. Meanwhile, in the skies above Normandy, the Allied bombers were beginning to make their presence felt. At 12:15 a.m. on June 6th, the first wave of aircraft, comprising 1,056 British and American heavy bombers, began to drop their payloads over key German strongpoints along the Atlantic Wall. The targets included fortified bunkers, artillery emplacements, and troop concentrations, all of which were critical to the German defense of the Normandy coast. As the bombs rained down, the sound of explosions and anti-aircraft fire echoed across the Norman countryside, shattering the peace and quiet of the sleepy villages and towns. In Colville-sur-Mer, the inhabitants huddled in their homes, praying for the dawn to come, as the thunderous noise of the bombing raid seemed to grow louder and closer by the minute. At the same time, the Allied airborne troops were taking to the skies, boarding their aircraft and preparing for the perilous journey ahead. At RAF Pottery, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were checking their equipment, attending to last-minute briefings, and mentally preparing themselves for the challenge that lay ahead. Their mission was to secure key objectives behind enemy lines, including bridges, road junctions, and strategic strongpoints, which would facilitate the advance of the seaborne troops. As the paratroopers lifted off into the night sky, they were joined by thousands of other airborne troops, all of whom were converging on Normandy from different directions. The 82nd Airborne Division, led by General Matthew Ridgway, was tasked with securing the area around Saint-Mère-Aglier, a critical road junction that controlled access to the beaches. The British 6th Airborne Division, meanwhile, was headed for the eastern flank of the invasion area, where they would secure key objectives such as the bridges over the Orne River and the canal. As the Allied airborne troops approached their drop zones, they encountered strong winds and thick cloud cover, which made navigation extremely difficult. Many of the aircraft were blown off course, and some of the paratroopers were dropped miles from their intended targets. Despite these challenges, however, the airborne troops persevered, using their training and initiative to adapt to the situation and achieve their objectives. At 2:30 a.m. on June 6th, the first Allied gliders began to touch down in Normandy, carrying troops and equipment into the heart of enemy territory. The glider troops, who were tasked with securing key objectives such as bridges and road junctions, quickly set to work, using their skills and training to overcome any opposition they encountered. As the night wore on, more and more gliders landed, disgorging their cargo of troops and equipment onto the Norman countryside. As the glider troops secured their objectives, the Allied airborne forces began to establish a foothold on Normandy soil. The 101st Airborne Division, led by General Maxwell Taylor, focused on securing the exits from Utah Beach, while the 82nd Airborne Division worked to capture key road junctions and bridges around Saint-Mère-Aglier. Despite being scattered across the countryside due to the challenging weather conditions, the paratroopers adapted quickly, using their training and initiative to regroup and achieve their missions. One of the most critical objectives for the 101st Airborne was the capture of the bridge over the Douve River at Bassay-Addeville, which controlled access to the beach exits. A group of paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, led by Lieutenant Richard D. Winters, successfully secured the bridge after a fierce firefight with German troops. This key victory ensured that the seaborne troops would be able to exit the beach and move inland without being pinned down by enemy fire. Meanwhile, the Allied naval armada was approaching the Normandy coast, carrying over 130,000 troops who would storm the beaches in the largest amphibious assault in history. The invasion fleet, codenamed Operation Neptune, consisted of 5 task forces, each assigned to a specific beach: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. As the ships approached the shore, they began to launch their landing craft, which would carry the troops into the maelstrom of battle. On board the USS Samuel Chase, General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, stood on the bridge, watching as the landing craft disembarked from the ship's davits and made their way towards the shore. The general knew that the next few hours would be crucial in determining the outcome of the invasion. He had planned for every eventuality, but he also knew that the unpredictable nature of war could throw up unexpected challenges. As the landing craft approached the beaches, they came under intense fire from German artillery and machine guns emplacements. The Allies had attempted to neutralize these strongpoints with a massive aerial bombardment, but many had survived and were now wreaking havoc on the invading forces. On Omaha Beach, the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced some of the toughest resistance as they struggled to establish a foothold on the beach. The Germans had fortified the bluffs overlooking the beach with concrete bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests, which made it nearly impossible for the Americans to advance. The landing craft were being blown out of the water, and the troops were being cut down by withering fire as they tried to exit the boats. It was clear that the battle for Omaha Beach would be one of the bloodiest and most intense fights of the entire invasion. On the other beaches, the Allies were faring slightly better. On Utah Beach, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, supported by tanks and artillery, managed to establish a solid foothold despite encountering some resistance from German troops. The British and Canadian forces on Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches also made steady progress, although they faced stiff opposition in some areas. As the morning wore on, the Allies began to gain traction on all 5 beaches, slowly but surely pushing the Germans back and establishing a solid foothold on Normandy soil. The battle was far from over, however, as the Germans were determined to throw the invaders back into the sea. The fighting would continue for days, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but the Allies had taken the first crucial step towards liberating Western Europe from German occupation. The airborne troops, now firmly established behind enemy lines, continued to play a vital role in the battle, disrupting German supply lines and communication networks, and securing key objectives such as bridges and road junctions. The 101st Airborne Division, in particular, had achieved significant success, capturing several critical objectives and paving the way for the seaborne troops to advance inland. As the day wore on, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, monitored the progress of the invasion from his headquarters in England. He knew that the battle was far from won, but he was cautiously optimistic about the prospects for success. The Allies had taken a crucial first step towards liberating Europe, and they would stop at nothing to ensure that the invasion was successful. As General Eisenhower monitored the progress of the invasion from his headquarters in England, he was keenly aware of the challenges that still lay ahead. The Allies had established a foothold on the beaches, but they had yet to link up with each other and form a continuous front line. The Germans were beginning to regroup and launch counterattacks, aiming to drive a wedge between the American and British forces. On Omaha Beach, the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were still struggling to overcome the German defenses. The bluffs overlooking the beach remained a major obstacle, with entrenched machine gun nests and artillery emplacements pouring fire down on the advancing troops. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, knew that he had to find a way to crack the German defenses if his forces were to make any progress. To address this challenge, Bradley ordered the deployment of tanks and artillery to support the infantry. The M4 Sherman tanks, with their 75mm guns, proved particularly effective in taking out German strongpoints, while the artillery provided covering fire to suppress enemy machine gun nests. As the day wore on, the Americans began to make slow but steady progress up the bluffs, with the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions eventually linking up with each other. Meanwhile, on Utah Beach, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division was making good progress, with its troops advancing rapidly inland. The division's commander, Major General Raymond O. Barton, had set his sights on the key town of Sainte-Mère-Église, which controlled the main road network in the area. As the Americans approached the town, they encountered fierce resistance from German paratroopers, who had been dropped behind enemy lines to disrupt Allied communications. The battle for Sainte-Mère-Église was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. However, the Americans eventually emerged victorious, securing the town and its vital road junctions. This victory allowed the U.S. 4th Infantry Division to continue its advance inland, linking up with the airborne troops who had been dropped behind enemy lines earlier that morning. The airborne troops, including the 101st Airborne Division, were playing a crucial role in the battle, disrupting German supply lines and communication networks. They had also secured key objectives, such as bridges and road junctions, which were essential for the advancing Allied forces. As the day wore on, the airborne troops continued to fight bravely, holding off German counterattacks and maintaining their grip on the strategic terrain they had seized. As night began to fall on D-Day, the Allies had established a solid foothold in Normandy, but the battle was far from over. The Germans were regrouping and preparing to launch a major counterattack, aiming to drive the invaders back into the sea. The Allies knew that they had to be prepared to face this challenge head-on, using all their military might to ensure that the invasion was successful. In the days that followed, the Allies would face some of their toughest challenges yet as they fought to expand their beachhead and push deeper into France. The battle for Normandy would be a long and bloody one, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. However, the Allies were determined to emerge victorious, knowing that the fate of Western Europe hung in the balance. As the sun set on D-Day, General Eisenhower received a report from his intelligence staff indicating that the Germans were massing their armored forces for a major counterattack. The report identified the Panzer-Lehr Division, one of Germany's most elite armored units, as being deployed to the Normandy front. Eisenhower knew that this division posed a significant threat to the Allied beachhead and that his forces would have to be prepared to face it head-on. As the sun set on D-Day, General Eisenhower's intelligence staff continued to monitor the German troop movements, tracking the Panzer-Lehr Division's advance towards the Normandy front. The division, led by General Fritz Bayerlein, was a formidable force, comprising over 200 tanks and 15,000 troops. Its arrival on the battlefield would significantly bolster the German defenses and pose a major challenge to the Allied forces. Meanwhile, on the ground, the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were consolidating their positions on Omaha Beach. Having finally overcome the German defenses on the bluffs, the Americans had suffered heavy casualties, with over 2,000 troops killed or wounded, but they had managed to establish a fragile foothold on the continent. As night fell, the divisions began to regroup and prepare for the next phase of the battle, knowing that the Germans would not give up easily. To the west, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division was making steady progress, advancing inland from Utah Beach and pushing towards the key town of Carentan. The division's commander, Major General Raymond O. Barton, had set his sights on securing the town's strategic road junctions, which would allow the Americans to link up with the airborne troops and begin the process of expanding the beachhead. As the night wore on, the Allied commanders began to receive reports of German troop movements, indicating that the enemy was regrouping and preparing to launch a counterattack. The British 50th Infantry Division, which had landed on Gold Beach, reported that German forces were massing in the vicinity of the town of Bayeux, while the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, which had landed on Juno Beach, encountered stiff resistance from German troops in the town of Courseulles-sur-Mer. In response to these developments, General Eisenhower ordered his commanders to prepare for a major battle, instructing them to reinforce their positions and be ready to repel any German counterattack. The Allies knew that the next few days would be crucial as they sought to expand their beachhead and begin the process of pushing deeper into France. On the morning of June 7th, the Germans launched a series of counterattacks against the Allied positions, aiming to drive a wedge between the American and British forces. The Panzer-Lehr Division, supported by infantry and artillery units, attacked the U.S. 1st Infantry Division on Omaha Beach, while the German 21st Panzer Division launched a simultaneous assault against the British 50th Infantry Division on Gold Beach. The battles that ensued were fierce and intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Americans on Omaha Beach found themselves facing a determined enemy, as the Germans sought to exploit any weaknesses in the Allied lines. Meanwhile, the British on Gold Beach were engaged in a desperate struggle to hold back the German counterattack, with the town of Bayeux hanging precariously in the balance. As the day wore on, the Allies began to gain the upper hand, thanks in large part to their superior air power and artillery support. The U.S. Air Force and the Royal Air Force launched a series of bombing raids against German troop concentrations, while Allied warships offshore provided naval gunfire support to the troops on the ground. As the Allied air power and artillery support began to take its toll on the German counterattack, the Panzerlehr Division's advance was slowed, and the U.S. 1st Infantry Division on Omaha Beach was able to hold its ground. The Germans had suffered significant losses, with over 50 tanks destroyed or damaged, and their infantry units were beginning to show signs of exhaustion. Meanwhile, the British 50th Infantry Division on Gold Beach was also gaining the upper hand, as the German 21st Panzer Division's attack began to falter. As the 4th Infantry Division advanced, they encountered increasingly stiff resistance from German forces, including elements of the 91st Air Landing Division and the 6th Parachute Regiment. To the east, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division was engaged in a fierce battle for the town of Courseulles-sur-Mer, which was a key objective on Juno Beach. The Canadians had landed on June 6th, but their advance had been slowed by strong German resistance, and they were still fighting to secure the town. The Canadian commander, Major General Rodney Keller, had committed his reserve battalions to the battle, and the Canadians were beginning to gain ground. However, the Germans were putting up a fierce fight, and the Canadians suffered heavy casualties as they fought their way through the town. As the battle for Normandy raged on, the Allied commanders were becoming increasingly concerned about the German armored reserves, which were still massing in the vicinity of Caen. The Allies knew that if the Germans were able to unleash a major armored counterattack, it could potentially threaten the entire beachhead. On June 8, the Allies launched a series of attacks aimed at securing key objectives and expanding the beachhead. The U.S. 1st Infantry Division on Omaha Beach launched an attack on the town of Formigny, which was a key strongpoint in the German defenses. The Americans were supported by naval gunfire from the USS Arkansas, which pounded the German positions with its 12-inch guns. Meanwhile, the British 50th Infantry Division on Gold Beach launched an attack on the town of Bayeux, which was a key objective in the Allied plan. As the Allies advanced, they encountered increasingly stiff resistance from German forces who were determined to hold their ground. The Germans had established a strong defensive line which ran from the town of Tilly-sur-Seulles to the town of Caen. This line was anchored on the left flank by the Panzerlehr Division and on the right flank by the 21st Panzer Division. The Allies knew that they would have to break through this line if they were to secure Normandy and begin the push into France. As the Allies advanced on June 8, they encountered fierce resistance from the German defensive line, which was anchored on the left flank by the Panzerlehr Division and on the right flank by the 21st Panzer Division. The U.S. 1st Infantry Division's attack on Formigny was supported by a barrage of artillery fire from the 116th Field Artillery Battalion, which pounded the German positions with its 105mm howitzers. Meanwhile, the British 50th Infantry Division's attack on Bayeux was led by the 69th Infantry Brigade, which advanced under cover of smoke and supporting fire from the Royal Navy's HMS Belfast. As the Allies pushed forward, they began to exploit weaknesses in the German defensive line. The U.S. 29th Infantry Division, which had landed on Omaha Beach on June 6, launched an attack on the town of Isigny-sur-Mer, which was a key strongpoint in the German defenses. The Americans were supported by a battalion of M4 Sherman tanks from the 747th Tank Battalion, which provided covering fire as they advanced through the town streets. The German forces, however, were far from defeated. On June 9, the Panzerlehr Division launched a counterattack against the U.S. 1st Infantry Division's positions near Formigny. The Germans advanced with a force of over 50 tanks, including several heavy Tiger I tanks, which caused significant damage to the American lines. However, the U.S. infantrymen held their ground, supported by a barrage of artillery fire and air support from P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. As the battle raged on, the Allies began to receive reinforcements from the sea. On June 10th, a convoy of ships arrived off the coast of Normandy, bringing with it thousands of fresh troops, tanks, and supplies. The U.S. 2nd Infantry Division, which had been held in reserve, was finally committed to battle, launching an attack on the town of Trébizonde, which was a key strongpoint in the German defenses. Meanwhile, the British 7th Armored Division, which had landed on Gold Beach on June 6, launched an attack on the town of Villers-Bocage, which was a key objective in the Allied plan. The battle for Normandy was now entering its second week, and the Allies were beginning to gain the upper hand. The German forces, however, were far from defeated, and they continued to fight fiercely, determined to hold their ground. As the Allies pushed forward, they encountered increasingly stiff resistance, but they also began to exploit weaknesses in the German defensive line. On June 12, the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division launched an attack on the town of Pont-l'Abbé, which was a key strongpoint in the German defenses, while the British 51st Highland Division launched an attack on the town of Saint-Mambu-Nori, which was a key objective in the Allied plan. As the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division launched its attack on Pont-l'Abbé, the British 51st Highland Division's assault on Saint-Mambu-Nori was met with fierce resistance from the German 21st Panzer Division. The Scotsmen of the 51st Highland Division, led by Major General Tom Rennie, advanced under cover of artillery fire from the 153rd Field Regiment, Royal Artillery, and supporting fire from the Royal Navy's HMS Roberts. Despite being pinned down by withering machine gun fire, the Highlanders managed to establish a foothold in the outskirts of Saint-Mambu-Nori, where they began to clear out German strongpoints house by house. Meanwhile, the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division's attack on Pont-l'Abbé was supported by a battalion of M4 Sherman tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion, which provided covering fire as the infantrymen advanced through the town streets. The Americans, led by Major General Walter M. Robertson, encountered stiff resistance from the German 3rd Parachute Division, but they managed to break through the German lines and secure key road junctions, cutting off the enemy's supply lines. As the Allies continued to push forward, they began to encounter increasingly fortified German positions, including the heavily fortified village of Carentan, which controlled access to the strategic port of Cherbourg. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division, led by Major General Maxwell D. Taylor, was tasked with securing Carentan, and on June 10, they launched a bold assault on the village. Supported by artillery fire from the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion and air support from P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, the Germans, led by Colonel Werner Ostendorf, put up a desperate defense, but the Americans eventually managed to break through their lines and secure the village. The fall of Carentan marked a significant turning point in the battle for Normandy, as it opened up the road to Cherbourg and allowed the Allies to begin pouring troops and supplies into the continent. As the Allies continued to push forward, they encountered increasingly determined German resistance, particularly from the elite SS Panzer divisions, which had been rushed to the front to stem the Allied tide. The SS Panzer divisions, led by seasoned commanders such as Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, were equipped with heavily armored Tiger tanks and were determined to hold their ground at all costs. On June 13, the British 7th Armored Division, led by Major General George Erskine, launched an attack on the village of Villers-Bocage, which was held by the SS Panzer Division Das Reich. The battle was fierce and intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The fall of Villers-Bocage marked another significant turning point in the battle for Normandy, as it allowed the Allies to begin pushing deeper into France. As the Allies continued to push forward, they began to encounter increasingly complex German defensive systems, including the heavily fortified Caen Canal Bridge, which controlled access to the strategic city of Caen. The British 3rd Infantry Division, led by Major General Tom Rennie, was tasked with securing the bridge, and on June 13, they launched a bold assault on the German positions, supported by artillery fire from the 33rd Field Regiment, Royal Artillery, and air support from Typhoon fighter bombers. The Germans put up a desperate defense, but the British eventually managed to break through their lines and secure the bridge. The Panzer-Lehr Division, led by General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, was equipped with heavily armored Panther tanks and was determined to hold its ground at all costs. On June 14, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, led by Major General Clarence R. Hubner, launched an attack on the village of Comont-el-Evente, which was held by the Panzer-Lehr Division. As the Allies continued to push forward, they began to encounter increasingly complex German defensive systems, including the heavily fortified port of Cherbourg, which controlled access to the English Channel. The U.S. 79th Infantry Division, led by Major General Ira T. Weech, was tasked with securing Cherbourg, and on June 19, they launched a bold assault on the German positions. Supported by artillery fire from the 314th Field Artillery Battalion and air support from P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. As the U.S. 79th Infantry Division pushed deeper into Cherbourg, they encountered fierce resistance from the German garrison, led by Generalleutnant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben. The city's defenses were formidable, with heavily fortified strongpoints, including the Cherbourg Arsenal, the harbor fortifications, and the Octeville Battery. Despite being outnumbered, the Germans put up a desperate fight, determined to hold the port at all costs. On June 21st, the U.S. 79th Infantry Division launched a final assault on the city, supported by artillery fire from the 314th Field Artillery Battalion and air support from P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers. However, the Americans eventually managed to break through the German lines and secure key strongpoints, including the Cherbourg Arsenal and the harbor fortifications. As the Germans retreated, they attempted to destroy the port facilities, including the docks, cranes, and warehouses. However, the U.S. Navy's demolition teams, led by Lieutenant Commander James Earl Riggins, worked tirelessly to repair and restore the damaged infrastructure, ensuring that the port could be used to supply the Allied armies. On June 26, Generalleutnant von Schlieben surrendered the remaining German forces in Cherbourg, marking a significant turning point in the battle for Normandy. The capture of the port allowed the Allies to pour troops, tanks, and supplies into France, paving the way for the eventual breakout from the Normandy beachhead. As the Allies consolidated their gains, they began to push deeper into France, with General Omar Bradley's U.S. First Army advancing towards the town of Saint-Lô, while General Bernard Montgomery's British Second Army pushed towards the city of Caen. The Germans, however, continued to resist, fiercely launching a series of counterattacks against the Allied lines. On July 3rd, the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, led by Major General Leroy H. Watson, launched an attack on the town of Villers-Bocage, which had been recaptured by the Germans. However, the Americans eventually managed to secure the town, marking a significant milestone in the campaign. As the Allies continued to push forward, they encountered increasingly determined German resistance, particularly from the elite SS Panzer divisions. On July 11th, the British 11th Armored Division, led by Major General Philip Roberts, launched an attack on the village of Bourg-à-Bousse, which was held by the SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. The Allies eventually managed to break through the German lines, marking a significant turning point in the campaign. On July 18th, General Montgomery launched Operation Goodwood, a massive armored assault on the city of Caen, which had been held by the Germans for over 6 weeks. As the Allies continued to push forward, they encountered increasingly complex German defensive systems, including the heavily fortified Seine River crossings. On August 19th, the U.S. 79th Infantry Division, led by Major General Ira T. Weech, launched an attack on the town of Elbeuf, which controlled access to the Seine River crossing. The Allies eventually managed to secure the town, marking a significant turning point in the campaign. On August 21st, General Eisenhower declared that the Normandy campaign was over and that the Allies had achieved their objectives. The battle for Normandy had been one of the bloodiest and most intense campaigns of the war, with over 400,000 casualties on both sides. However, the Allies continued to push forward, driven by their determination to liberate Western Europe from German occupation. On August 25th, the Allies liberated the city of Paris, marking a significant milestone in the campaign. The Battle for Normandy had been a decisive victory for the Allies, marking a significant turning point in the war. The campaign had been characterized by fierce and intense fighting, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. However, the Allies had ultimately emerged victorious, paving the way for the eventual defeat of Germany and the liberation of Western Europe. The D-Day Normandy landings will forever be etched in the annals of history as a pivotal moment in the struggle for freedom and democracy. The bravery, sacrifice, and determination of the Allied forces who stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, paved the way for the liberation of Western Europe from the grip of tyranny, shaping the course of modern history and inspiring generations to come. The courage, camaraderie, and conviction of those who fought for our freedom continue to inspire us today, serving as a powerful reminder of the enduring strength of the human spirit. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.